In the 17th century, Jewish immigrants sought refuge and new opportunities in the Dutch colony of Suriname, a territory on the northeastern coast of South America. Many of these settlers were Sephardic Jews, descendants of Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal during the Inquisition. They arrived in Suriname from Dutch Brazil, the Caribbean, and Europe, lured by the promise of religious freedom, land ownership, and economic opportunities. However, as they worked to establish agricultural colonies and maintain their cultural identity, the Jewish settlers faced significant challenges, from environmental hardships to social and economic pressures. Suriname's Jewish settlement began in earnest in the 1650s, when the colony was still under British control, but gained momentum after the Dutch took over in 1667. The Dutch authorities, recognizing the economic potential of Jewish expertise in agriculture and trade, granted Jews a level of autonomy and religious freedom uncommon in other colonies. The Jews were allowed to establish their own communities, practice their faith openly, and own land. This attracted a considerable number of Jewish settlers who primarily established themselves along the Suriname River in what became known as the Jewish Savanna, or Joden Savanne. The Jewish Savanna quickly became the center of Jewish life in Suriname. Here, the settlers established plantations, growing crops such as sugarcane, coffee, and cacao, which were labor-intensive and required significant investment in infrastructure and enslaved labor. Jewish planters were among the first in the colony to use African enslaved people for large-scale agricultural production, as was common in the Caribbean and South American colonies. Despite these efforts, they faced numerous difficulties in making their plantations profitable. The tropical environment posed many challenges, including frequent flooding, diseases, and nutrient-poor soils that made sustainable farming difficult. The settlers had to constantly adapt to the harsh conditions, which threatened the viability of their agricultural ventures. Maintaining their cultural and religious identity in this remote and challenging environment was another significant struggle. The Jewish community in Suriname was determined to preserve its Sephardic traditions, language, Ladino, and religious practices. They built a synagogue, Beracha Veshalom, in the Jewish Savanna in 1685, which became a focal point for religious life and social gatherings. The synagogue's construction reflected the settlers' desire to maintain a connection to their heritage, despite the physical and cultural isolation of the colony. However, maintaining Jewish practices was difficult due to the lack of rabbis and religious scholars, as well as the challenge of observing Jewish dietary laws and festivals in a tropical environment with limited access to kosher food and traditional supplies. Intermarriage and integration with other settlers in Suriname also posed challenges to the preservation of a distinct Jewish cultural identity. Over time, interactions with non-Jewish settlers, including Dutch Protestants and African communities, led to a blending of cultural practices. Although the Jewish community had a degree of autonomy, there were concerns about the younger generation adopting non-Jewish customs or moving away from traditional practices. Efforts to maintain strict community boundaries were complicated by the diverse and multicultural nature of Suriname, where Jews, Christians, Africans, and indigenous peoples lived in close proximity. Economic pressures also contributed to the community's difficulties. While some Jewish planters achieved wealth through their plantations, many others struggled due to the volatile nature of the agricultural market and the colony's dependence on enslaved labor. Slave uprisings were not uncommon, and the Jewish plantations, often isolated and smaller than those owned by Dutch planters, were especially vulnerable. In some cases, escaped enslaved Africans formed maroon communities in the surrounding forests and launched attacks on plantations, including those owned by Jews. These threats not only jeopardized the safety and economic stability of the settlers, but also highlighted the moral and ethical tensions within the Jewish community regarding the institution of slavery. The Jewish Savanna faced a significant decline by the late 18th century. Several factors contributed to its downturn, including the depletion of soil fertility, economic competition, natural disasters, and the abolition of slavery. As plantations became less profitable, many Jewish families abandoned the Jewish Savanna and moved to the capital, Paramaribo, where they pursued other economic activities, such as trade and craftsmanship. The decline of the Jewish Savanna marked the end of an era for Suriname's Jewish agricultural community, although the legacy of the settlement continued in the cultural and religious life of the Jewish population in Paramaribo. Despite these hardships, the Jewish community in Suriname played a significant role in the colony's history and left a lasting impact. They contributed to the economic development of Suriname, particularly through their early involvement in agriculture and trade. Their cultural influence persisted with the remnants of the Jewish Savanna, including the Berache Ve Shalom Synagogue and the Old Cemetery, serving as historical landmarks. The Jewish population in Paramaribo continued to thrive, forming one of the oldest continuous Jewish communities in the Americas. The story of Jewish immigrants in 17th-century Suriname is one of resilience and adaptation in the face of adversity. The settlers sought to maintain their cultural identity and religious practices while navigating the challenges of a harsh environment, economic difficulties, and social integration. Although the agricultural colonies ultimately declined, the Jewish community's efforts to sustain their traditions and contribute to the colony's growth highlight the complexities of immigrant life in the early modern period. Their experiences offer a window into the broader themes of diaspora, cultural preservation, and the struggle for identity in a colonial context.